Hello, my name is Vargas, and my 2020 EMBC presentation is titled Stiffness Perception Using Transcutaneous Electrical Stimulation During Active and Passive Prosthetic Control. Haptic feedback is essential to the performance of many activities of daily living. A lack of tactile feedback can severely limit the use of an individual's assistive device. Reductions in device utility often affects the user's confidence and satisfaction, leading to device abandonment. As prosthetic limbs and other devices advance, it is essential to provide tactile feedback to the user to improve control intuitiveness and reduce future device abandonment. Several studies have shown that delivery of sensory feedback describing grasp forces and/or joint angles improves task performance and promotes increased user confidence. A series of mechanoreceptors embedded in our skin allow neurologically intact individuals to sense various forms of tactile information. When grasping a deformable object, stiffness information can be characterized based on the rate of change of the force imposed onto the skin surface. Stiffness is a vital property that describes an object's resistance to a given force. Fine movements rely on the ability to perceive stiffness, especially when manipulating delicate objects. Prior work has shown that stiffness information can be delivered using mechanical or electrical stimulation. In these cases, stiffness recognition is performed through the interpretation of modulated stimuli as it pertains to the exerted forces from a prosthetic limb. This has been performed using both active and passive control, raising the question of whether the control condition implemented affects a user's stiffness perception accuracy. To answer this question, the purpose of the study was to evaluate if and to what degree recognition accuracy is affected when a prosthetic hand is passively or actively articulated. In this study, sensory feedback was delivered using transcutaneous nerve stimulation in order to evoke somatotopic haptic sensation non-invasively. Using a 2x8 electrode grid placed on the upper arm, different electrode pairs can activate different portions of the median and ulnar nerve, eliciting sensation at distinct regions along the hand. Previous work has shown that by modulating the stimulation amplitude, graded sensations can be perceived and used to discriminate various object properties such as stiffness, shape, and surface topology. Building on this approach, active myoelectric control was implemented to compare its recognition accuracy to that observed during passive control. In this preliminary study, we tested 3 neurologically intact subjects. Using a fixed pulse width and frequency, current amplitude was modulated based on the force recordings from a prosthetic hand. A force sensor fixed on the prosthesis index fingertip recorded the pinch grasp forces during a given grasp. Forces exerted were converted to current amplitudes using a subject-specific sigmoid transfer function. For each subject, the sensory threshold and just below the motor threshold were used as the stimulation range. Using current steps of 0.1 milliamps, the sensory and motor thresholds were found when finger sensation or finger motion first occurred, respectively. Active control was implemented using a wireless acquisition system. 2 channels of electromyography recorded the muscle activation of the extrinsic flexor and extensor muscles of the finger and wrist. For real-time force acquisition modulated the delivered stimulation train in order to elicit sensation that resembled the given interaction. The EMG was recorded and processed in real time to control the articulation of the prosthetic's index finger. Using a threshold-based system, the level of activation was extracted from the rectified and filtered signal. The differential between the EMG signals determined the direction in which the prosthetic articulated, meaning whether the finger was in rest, closed, or opened, using one of 3 set speeds. To encode the stiffness of an object, the rate of change of the index finger forces, or evoked index finger sensations, corresponded to the object's stiffnesses. 3 stiffness varied cubes were used, which included a soft foam, a stiff foam, and a wooden block. During active control, the prosthetic hand's hand closing speed was set to either 40, 55, or 67 degrees per second. These speeds were determined through preliminary testing. Example force traces for the highest speed are shown for each stiffness level, along with the average time to peak across all conditions. The time to peak was calculated based on the time between initial contact with the object and the first instance in which the peak was reached. To evaluate the stiffness recognition accuracy during passive control, prosthesis-object interactions were pre-recorded. The force traces were saved among a pool for each condition and then drawn from at random during the study. Force traces were converted to current amplitudes using the same sigmoid function implemented during active control. Force recordings were repeated 5 times for each combination of object stiffness and speed to account for any variability in the system. The experiment began by searching through the electrode grid for a pair that produced sensation along the subject's index finger. The selected pair was then coupled to the index finger's force sensor or sensor recordings in order to modulate stimulation intensity during active and passive control, respectively. The main experiment was broken into 2 experimental blocks based on whether passive or active control was being implemented. The order in which the blocks were performed were randomized across subjects. Each subject was visually and auditorily blinded throughout the study. Prior to the start of the active trials, subjects were given 5 minutes to practice articulating the prosthesis. Reinforcement learning was utilized before the start of each sub-block. Subjects were given 10 to 15 trials where they would familiarize themselves with the object's stiffnesses. This was the only time subjects were given feedback about their response. We evaluated each subject's ability to recognize an object's stiffness during both passive and active control. The 2 confusion matrices compare the actual and perceived object stiffness across all subjects. Each row within a given stiffness level corresponds to individual hand closing speeds. The results suggest that as the speed increases, the number of errors and the distribution of the errors appear to increase as well. Misidentification between the medium and high stiffness object appear more frequently as higher speeds are implemented for both control schemes. Recognition accuracy and standard error across subjects are shown at each of the 3 hand closing speeds. The results showed that subjects could identify a given object stiffness during both active and passive control at all 3 speeds, with accuracies all greater than chance value. Specifically, the closing speeds of 40, 55, and 67 degrees per second resulted in accuracies greater than 77% during passive control. Alternatively, during active control, the recognition accuracies were slightly lower, resulting in accuracies greater than 75%. When evaluating the accuracies of individual subjects, only a single subject showed consistent changes in accuracy when comparing passive and active conditions. This subject showed consistently lower recognition accuracy during active trials. Our results demonstrated that object stiffness could be recognized using both active and passive control at all 3 hand closing speeds. Increasing hand closing speed appeared to reduce recognition accuracy in both conditions. A slightly lower accuracy was observed during active control in one subject in particular, which indicated that the sensorimotor integration processes could affect haptic perception for some users. Based on the initial data, evaluating the sensorimotor integration processes involved in prosthetic control individually can provide insight that can help improve prosthetic dexterity. As control schemes become more complex, the benefit of testing sensory feedback in active and passive formats are further increased through the ability to detect potential issues residing in the motor and sensory pathways of current human-machine interfaces.